Welcome back to another Buckeye State of the Union presented by Hoggy's. Best barbecue in Columbus. Go ahead, check them out on Bethel Road. Again, smash burgers over the weekend. They are $8. You cannot beat that deal. Great food product. We highly recommend that you go check them out. Like Biscardi with the Silver Bulletin. I'm joined today by Dillon Davis of the Delaware Gazette.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, sir. We just heard from Ryan Day in his weekly press conference on Monday this week. A little bit of a different practice schedule for Ohio State as they're wrapping up the spring here. But Dillon, we got to be here for Student Appreciation Day on Saturday. So between Student Appreciation Day and then today, what have we learned about Ohio State football? What was standing out to you, position group wise? What did you see?
Well, it's always good to be able to get a chance to see team portions of practice. We don't always get to see that, and that's when you really start to glean things and pick up from how guys are performing, plays are being made, and certainly when they go back and watch film, that's what they're looking for. So being able to be here on Saturday and watch Student Appreciation Day, that was fantastic. What stood out to me was really probably what a lot of guys were taking away from it. Devin McCuin looked fantastic.
Yeah.
There's a lot of questions about this Ohio State receiver room, maybe for the first time in a long time. We've just grown so accustomed to Ohio State's receiver room being elite, and it's probably going to be elite again, but there's question marks, so you just don't know, and you don't want to take it for granted, especially with Hartline no longer there. Watching Devin McCuin run around out there, knowing what Jeremiah is, knowing that Brandon Inniss is going to be solid, and you're not even talking about Kyle Parker yet and what some of the young guys, your Chris Henry Jr.'s and Brock Boyd's could do. Devin McCuin made me feel a lot better about where Ohio State's receiver room is, because that dude's his speed's legit. He's going to get open, working underneath. Jeremiah Smith as well is one going to help him. So, that stood out to me for sure. And then I continue to be, and we're probably going to talk about him more here in a little bit, but Earl Little Jr. continues to be impressive to me.
Right.
If you watch Ryan Day's press conference today, he alluded to it. You're not going to replace Caleb Downs, but Earl Little's versatility and what he can bring to that secondary, I think that Ohio State, for as much as you could possibly lessen the blow of losing Caleb Downs, I think Ohio State's going to come away from this feeling really good about where they are post Caleb Downs because they brought Earl Little in. So.
Yeah, and that's what we keep noticing from whether it's Ryan Day or we're talking to Jeremiah Smith, some of the players. Earl Little's name keeps coming up in conversation. Anytime you have transfers come in or you have freshmen whose name keeps coming up, because that's going to raise the red flags of okay, this guy is going to be legit. He's continuing to make plays. Then you mentioned those receivers right offhand, just kind of doing a drive-through of what you just talked about from Student Appreciation Day and what we've noticed. First time we're seeing transfer receivers at Ohio State. Yeah. How do you think that they match up to the guys that Ohio State already had in the room there when you're looking at Devin McCuin and Kyle Parker?
Well, I tell you, the first time we talked to Ryan Day, I think it was after day one of spring practice.
Yep.
And he was asked about Kyle Parker and Devin McCuin, and the first thing he said was they were pros. Mm-hmm. They were ready to practice at Ohio State from day one and knew what to expect, and they just kind of hit the ground running. So that told me right away those guys are going to assimilate perfectly into that room. Obviously we know Jeremiah Smith's work ethic is legendary. Brandon Inniss is the same kind of guy. Maybe while he doesn't get as much attention, Brandon Inniss is a worker as well. Mm-hmm. And the way that those guys, Ryan praised them for their work ethic right away, told me those guys are going to fit right in. And again, knowing Devin's speed, knowing Kyle Parker was able to play at LSU, which is it's an NFL factory in its own right at the position. I had no question those guys are going to fit in right away, and certainly as we're seeing that more and more, it seems like that's all seamless. So,
right, and Jeremiah Smith, he speaks for himself. I mean, his greatness. He's going into year 3. There's not a ton to say about Jeremiah Smith besides watch out for the rest of college football. But you see guys behind him like Chris Henry's probably going to be the guy that's behind him. How he sees the field might be interesting because Jeremiah Smith's a guy you can shift around and play different positions. That way Chris Henry doesn't have to go ahead and learn all 3 positions. He's not much of a slot guy, but he could still learn 2 positions, but it's easier if he's just focusing on his one to get him on the field. But looking at Kyle Parker, Devin McCuin, and then Brock Boyd. Yeah. I think Brock Boyd's the other name. Like you're talking about Earl Little on defense, Brock Boyd on offense. Yeah. I saw a couple routes from Brock Boyd. There were some that were clipped on social media that we didn't see before we were able to come in here. Then also what we did see when we were in here. Brock Boyd does look the part already as a freshman. He's the one that stood out to me. He put Jermaine on skates on one play, and it just right down there in the far end of the end zone.
Far right down there.
Yeah, he just great burst out of his route.
Right.
I mean, he looks like he can get on the field for Ohio State pretty early. I mean, maybe not day one started like Jeremiah Smith, but I mean, he's going to contribute in roles. What have you seen from him, and how do you think having a guy like Brock Boyd and then also a guy like Legend Bay who can come out of the backfield and play that H-back role, how do you think those 2 pieces can factor into this offense for Ohio State? Because they're different than what Ohio State's had before at that position.
Different is the perfect word. And I'll tell you what, before I say any of this, that clip we saw down there in that far end zone where he did a little stop and just basically froze the cornerback. I was standing right there with Davis Igmanosin, who was standing right. He was right in front of me. He was there on Saturday, and I was standing. When that happened, there was a note of gasp from Davis Igmanosin. He knew that Brock got him. And so Brock's legit. How his playing time manifests this year, I'm not sure. We're talking about this room and how full it is right now of guys that are capable of seeing the field. So I'm not sure what that means for him this year. But Brock Boyd's talent, all this hype that he's getting, it's real. I don't think there's any reason to believe it's not real. But if there was any question in front of a building full of people, students, parents, recruits, former players, the entire media, Brock Boyd showed it again on Saturday in front of all those people, erasing any doubt like that he's a kid who's going to see the field very early on for Ohio State, and rightfully so. If it's this year, I don't know how much it is this year. I'm not sure, but it'll be early, and certainly if injuries arise, he's a player that could find himself, in the lineup and capably doing so as well. But going back to Legend, I think Legend specifically. Now Legend's been out. He's not been practicing. They're hoping to get him back soon. So, that kind of stunts his development a little bit because he's still trying to figure out his way in his first spring practice. But in general, the player, he gives something Ohio State hasn't had. Ryan Day called him Curtis Samuel, even though Ryan Day wasn't here with Curtis Samuel. He kind of alluded to Curtis Samuel in that role. And certainly Ohio State fans remember what Curtis Samuel was, both in the backfield and then kind of doing some different things, split out. Ohio State hasn't had that since, and I look at Legend Bay, and he reminds me of what I always thought Dontre Wilson would be. And Dontre never quite got to that level, but that's what I hope Legend Bay becomes. If he does, it's just, again, it's a different weapon that Ohio State hasn't had. When you talk about what Ohio State has in the receiver room, what we think we know about the running back room when those guys are healthy, what Bo Jackson brings, and certainly Isaiah, and maybe Jacoby Jackson, depending on how that shakes out. But what we think that Ohio State has in the running back room, Legend's just like this kind of this Swiss Army knife. They can, to play off of all of that, and Ohio State just hasn't had that. How they utilize them, I can't even really speculate on how Ohio State might utilize them because they just haven't had the opportunity to have a player like that. But I'm certainly really excited for that, and I hope he can get back on the field because he still has some proving to do. I know all the talking that we've done or people have said about Legend Bay, the talent is legit. He's still going through his first 7 or 8. Well, I guess not even been practicing the last 2. So he's been through 4 or 5 spring practices. So he still has a ways to go. We saw Carlos Loughlin, riding him a little bit, in some of those early practices. So he still has to prove that he can hold on to the football. Yep. That like when he's in the backfield, that he can step up in pass protection. And I tell you what, I got to mention this. Being a Delaware guy, favor or key on Saturday. We talk about takeaways. I know nobody's probably thinking about favor or key in that running back room, but given Bo Jackson and Isaiah West being out and how thin that room is, and now Legend missing practices, like Favor Key got a very big opportunity on Saturday to be in a featured role in that backfield for Ohio State, and he made the most of it. On several different occasions, he had Carlos Loughlin just absolutely fired up. One time was in pass protection, which I was talking about Legend Bay.
Absolutely.
For a true freshman running back, that's one of the first things that you kind of think, like, is he capable of doing that and being trusted? Favor did it on one occasion, and Carlos Loughlin was fired up. Favor Key caught a ball out of the backfield and scored on it down in the red zone. Carlos Loughlin fired up, had a couple nice runs as well. So, by all accounts, Favor Key had a really nice Saturday practice. And so, while I don't think that he's going to be a factor in the running back room come fall camp, for the opportunities he's getting right now, he's looked fantastic. So that should be said.
Yeah, and even what you're talking about with pass protection, as a true freshman when you're coming into this room, or even as a younger guy in the room, another way you can get on the field is if you do elevate in pass protection because you got to protect your quarterback. I mean, you're going to be asked to do that, and if you can step up in that way, that might say, hey, when we're looking at the file and say, all right, who's next man up? That's going to be a little check in favor of Key's favor there that can go say, hey, he might be able to get on the field in these situations, or maybe it's on third down. We don't know. I mean, probably not as a true freshman, but just as he develops and as he progresses, those are things that you want to see because as he becomes a second and third year player, that's a huge part of the running back game that probably goes unnoticed because you always want to see the ball in their hands and say, how explosive can they be? Can they get to the second level? What's going to happen when the ball's in their hands? Can they catch a pass out of the backfield? All those different aspects of the game. But then, Dillon, even with this room, we're missing Bo Jackson and Isaiah West here in the spring. So it's a lot of opportunities for the younger guys to go ahead and say, hey, these are critical reps. And you said Favor Key made the most of it. So you look at the wide receiver room, lots of depth. You look at the running back room, there's lots of depth, but the injuries are there. So you're not really seeing that on-field product the way you're seeing it from the wide receivers. Sure. But as we get to the summer and fall camp, we're going to see that from the running back room.
Yeah, and if there's any room, where you feel good about as a true freshman coming in here, like if you handle your business, you might get a chance to play. It's certainly in the running back room because we just saw it last year for one with Bo Jackson, and it stuck with me leading into the season last year in fall camp, asking Carlos Loughlin about the opportunities that Bo might have, and even Isaiah to a lesser degree, frankly, but with the opportunities they might have. At every turn, Carlos Loughlin would tell us, if you're good enough, you're old enough, as in basically saying, throw out, what they are, true freshmen, redshirt freshmen, whatever the case may be. If you show that you're good enough, you're going to play here at Ohio State. as early as you're ready. And Carlos Loughlin made good on that because we saw Bo Jackson eventually become their best running back and their featured running back. So when you look at Favorite Key, and a guy and what he's doing right now, there's no. I mean, we assume that like Isaiah West and Bo Jackson, they're going to come back from their little shoulder procedures. And I know it is an abundance of caution. Don't get me wrong, but running back's a physical position, and you already have a little shoulder injuries and things like that. Things happen, and it's not hard to see how that running back room, which I think is deep right now,
Absolutely.
with quality, options, could become, not so deep anymore. So Favorite Key's not that far away. I don't think that he's going to be. I put it this way: if he's a featured, back in Ohio State's offense this year, then things went terribly wrong in that room.
Yes.
And that's no disrespect to Favorite whatsoever, but it's not that crazy to take the leap and say, how does it get there? Where you're looking at Favorite Key and saying, is this kid going to have to play? It's a true freshman, so.
Right. Even Dillon, too. We're talking about the wide receivers, talking about the running backs. We know what Julian's saying is. Ryan Day said he just has to take that next step forward. He has to command the offense more. He said you try to protect a first-year or a younger starting quarterback, but he's not that anymore. Yeah. He's old. He's done this. He now has to operate the offense, and he has to be the guy that's helping those around him. The offensive line, you're missing a couple of guys. How's this offensive line going to move? Factoring into the season for Ohio State, because last year you looked at Ohio State and said if there was a weakness on the Buckeyes, it was the offensive line and how they would be able to progress as the season goes along. And then in those matchup style games, could they block? They could not. But they said today, this group, they return a ton of production. They have the most continuity in the country, or near the top of the list. And he said those 4th and 5th year guys, you see that as the trend right now in college football, that's really when you see that growth and that development and that forward step to say, okay, this could be a Joe Moore award-winning offensive line. How do you see that?
I mean, Brian Day was asked about continuity along the offensive line and how important that is to him. I think maybe more so than any other position group in football, continuity is important along the offensive line. They're going to have that, plenty this year, assuming they're all healthy. So, there's still some unknowns there because we don't know how it's going to look, like where guys are going to be at. Like Ryan Day has said this year after year. Tyler Bowen said this, they're going to try to get their best five on the field. Yeah. And what that looks like, we don't ever really know. Typically, it ends up coming back to what we think it would look like anyways. But in general, you don't know what that is here in the spring, what their best five, who their best five are, and where those best five are slotted. Because a lot of these guys, they're cross-training, they can play, tackle or guard. So what that looks like, I don't know. What I do know, though, is like we talk about continuity, but I think the biggest thing for this offensive line and why I'm most excited about it is a guy that didn't really play a whole lot last year, Ian Moore, that I think his insertion into the starting lineup, I think takes this offensive line to a new level. I think it was the missing piece. Look, we could sit here and talk about what we thought was the weak link of the Ohio State offensive line last year. I think it's, most people, if you polled, 100 Ohio State fans, probably 90 of them would have the same answer. I think if you eliminated that part of it and inserted an Ian Moore, a guy who looked like he was ready to play from, first opportunity he got at Purdue, if you would have inserted that, I think this offensive line would have taken a step forward. Now, it is what it is, and now here we are in the spring. And ultimately going into the fall, you put him in that lineup with the guys that are coming back, and I think that's the makings of a really good offensive line, as you talked about, with their veteran presence and how much football they played. Ian Moore looks like he wasn't overwhelmed by the moment last year. Right. So I can imagine if he's starting game 2 in Austin, Texas, I don't think he's going to be overwhelmed by that either, because he doesn't seem like the kind of guy who would do that, and certainly wasn't last year in the opportunities he got. Joe Moore Award, I don't know. I'm not going that far. Yeah. I was really high on Ohio State's offensive line last year because I thought that a guy like Tager would take a step forward. I assumed that would be the case. It didn't progress like that, and it ended up being something that weighted them down. Now, don't get me wrong; it wasn't just Tager against Miami or Indiana that that let them down. So I'm not putting those losses all on Tager Shabola, but certainly, by all means, it was a very obvious weak link. But I was barely high on them last year. I'm going to be high on them again this year. I'm going to continue to sing the praises of the offensive line because I think that they have a chance to be among the best units in the country, and they're going to need to be certainly because. Even though Julian does need to take the next step, forward next year, like the schedule and what it is, right. For any quarterback, it's it's going to be really tough. So they're going to have to be able to run the ball, obviously. So they're going to be tested early and often. But I think very highly of the offensive line.
And it looked like, too, they've been in the weight room a little bit more. Like, you can see the size that some of these guys have put on. Like, we talked to Luke Montgomery pretty early on, and noticeable. Like, Luke, you look bigger, man.
Right. And that Ian Moore looks the part. So
exactly.
I don't want to keep on going back to Ian Moore, but he looks the part. Like, oh, yeah, that dude should be starting at Ohio State, at left tackle. Now, whether it ultimately starts, left, right tackle, guard, whatever the case may be. But he looks like a starting left tackle at Ohio State, which usually when you look at those guys, you're thinking about, cornerstone tackles for NFL teams, and he looks the part, and for whatever that's worth. And hey, their depth as well. Ryan Day touched on some depth, as well. Carter Lowe getting opportunities this spring with some injury. Certainly Ian doing his thing. Make no mistake about it. The second team offensive line on Saturday had a very, very rough day.
They did.
I will not sugarcoat that. They got bullied early and often by Ohio State's defensive front. Guys like Sam Greer and Jay Cook, very young guys. So, I'm not saying, bury those guys in the depth chart by any means, because I think very highly of both of those guys. Speaking of looking the part as future, cornerstone linemen for Ohio State, but those guys had a very rough day. So, but they're getting opportunities, and out of that, you hope there's a lot of development that comes out of that, because they did get pushed around a lot on Saturday. But I promise you, some very valuable lessons were learned for some guys in there that maybe wouldn't have otherwise gotten those lessons in those settings. With a lot of eyeballs on them. If Ohio State was fully healthy, so there is some good that can come of that.
Absolutely, it has to be treated as a learning lesson, because Ohio State's rotating differently. They're trying different things out. There's a lot of beta testing, if you will, for a term to use for this Ohio State offensive line right now through the spring. But Dillon, if we flip to the defensive side of the ball, to close the show here, you started with Earl Little. He's a name that's been coming up. Jay Timmons, also a true freshman. How early he gets on the field, we don't know, but he's another one that keeps coming up too. But replacing Caleb Downs, that's pretty tough to do. Sure. Then you add in replacing Caleb Downs, Sonny Styles, Arvell Reese, and Caden McDonald. It's even tougher to do. But it seems like Ohio State feels pretty good about the transfers that they brought in on defense, whether it's James Smith, like Ryan Day said today, that Larry Johnson is really challenging him. He sees the flash, he sees the potential, he sees the athleticism, but now sustain that high-level play for an extended period of time. And that's what he wants to see from Smith and how he progresses. So from what we're seeing, what you saw on Saturday, the defensive transfers, how do you evaluate those guys as compared to, okay, Ohio State has to replace a lot on defense, and this is what this on-field product could look like in the fall?
Yeah, I tell you, I was struck by what Ryan Day said about James Smith, because James Smith, Ryan said that he's flashed. We've seen him flash.
Yeah.
He lost his black stripe on Saturday, so we know he's been flashing. But Ryan Day said that he's being challenged by Larry Johnson to sustain a high-level play for a longer period of time. And as soon as Ryan said that, I thought back to the way people were talking about Caden McDonald going into last year, because that was the question with Caden McDonald. We saw 2 years ago in the national title run what Caden McDonald was in short burst. Saw it in the Penn State game and that critical goal line stand in the fourth quarter. Now, we saw what Caden McDonald was like in the opportunities that he got. But after Tyleik Williams left, could Caden McDonald do that for 40 plays instead of 25 plays in a game? And we saw Caden McDonald could absolutely do that. And so now Larry Johnson's kind of, challenging James Smith in that same way. Yep. And I have every reason to believe that Larry Johnson will get James Smith to be that guy, just in the same way they did Caden McDonald, because if he does, James Smith's going to be a real player for Ohio State. Like, I think there's no doubt about it. First of all, when you stand next to him, there were a couple times I was standing on the defensive sideline for Saturday's practice, and so there were a couple times he's coming off, like he's standing next to him, just a massive human being, very, very, very big human being. You could tell that conditioning wise, Saturday was a hard practice. The team portions of that they were going at it. So, and he was gassed, and to be understood. I get it, but he's certainly conditioning part of it. He's still gonna have to get that in check. But when they do, like he's a player that Ohio State's not gonna want to take off the field, and that's very obvious. Earl Little, I could say what everybody else is saying about Earl Little. Like I don't need to. Like Earl Little is going to be a player in Ohio State secondary. How they use him, I'm still fascinated to see what that means, because I don't think any of us really know, exactly how it looks. The fact that he's even talking about Ryan Day's even talking about Earl Little in the same breath as Caleb Downs shows you that they're comfortable already and using him in different ways. So what that looks like, I don't know, but I do know that Earl Little is going to be a very, very important piece of Ohio State secondary, and a good one at that. And then also, it's not just like Earl Little. Like I asked about the cornerbacks,
right?
So, and I think it kind of gets overlooked because everybody just assumes Jermaine is going to start. Now he will, and then like Devin Sanchez. All the play time that he got last year, he's just going to step up, and again, I think he ultimately will as well. But like I thought Dominick Kelly looked really impressive. Yes. The Georgia transfer. Again, you talk about prototypes. That doesn't mean anything. Like Ohio State's nothing but prototypes. But like you talk about a prototype cornerback, he's big. He looks strong. Like Dominick Kelly looks like, hey, yeah, that's the kind of cornerback that you want to play. Starting at Ohio State. And I thought he looked good. In running around and in coverage as well on Saturday. So, it's not just Earl Little. Like we could talk about Earl Little all we want to. He's legit. Jeremiah Smith's stamp of approval is probably all you need to talk about Earl Little.
Exactly.
when you ask Jeremiah Smith, like, who's standing out in the secondary, and Jeremiah Smith says Earl Little, and then Jeremiah Smith says, like, basically, like, he's going to hit, he's going to be physical, and he's the real deal, and I don't want to say too much else because he's trying to limit, the hype train a little bit. When Jeremiah Smith says that, then just go ahead and assume that Earl Little's going to be a dude for Ohio State in the secondary. So take that out, away. Ryan Day was complimentary to Terry Moore as well. I think Terry Moore maybe is starting to get a little bit overlooked because of what Earl Little's doing early on. But as Ryan said, Matt Guerrero had Terry Moore at Duke, so there's familiarity there. Matt Guerrero wanted to go get that guy when Terry Moore was available for a reason. So I think Ohio State's just in a very healthy place. It's a little bit, I guess, worrisome, if you will, just the lack of experience and just a lot of assumptions we're making or projections. And look, to be fair, we don't know. We get to fall camp and even into the season, and they go to Austin, Texas, and maybe it's not what I thought it would look like. But I think for right now, where they're at in the spring as a group, between the corners and the safeties, the secondary as a whole, I think Ohio State's in a really good place with the guys they brought in. Again, that's just from what we've seen. So
right, even going back to what you're saying with James Smith and the guys like Terry Moore or Earl Little coming all in as transfers, and then Quay Rusall as well too. Yeah. Ryan Day said it's like Ohio State has a blueprint for development here, and then they have the testimony to back that up. So like you're saying with Caden McDonald and how he progressed last year because Larry Johnson wants him to get there, if he follows the protocols that Ohio State has in place, James Smith will elevate to that now. He may not be a top 15 draft pick because of it, but he's going to elevate to that level that Ohio State needs him to be, as will these guys in the secondary, because you see it year after year with turnout from Ohio State to the NFL, first-round draft picks, high draft picks, at the skill position players, on lines of scrimmage, and now maybe this is the year that Ohio State gets back to that on the offensive line and the defensive line as well too, instead of just being the defensive line. And then Dillon, like the last thing that we'll talk about is just the kicking game. Connor Hawkins comes in, veteran kicker. He's going to feel like Mike Nugent to everybody when he makes his first 50-yarder for this season, because Ohio State's not done that since 2019. Just what we saw, Connor Hawkins ended student appreciation practice. Ryan Day brought everybody on the field, get around him. A little bit of a high-pressure situation for him. He had to make the kick, or else everybody had to run. How valuable is it going to be for Ohio State to have a kicker again?
That situation at Student Appreciation Day, just, full disclosure, they do that every year. So Jaden Fielding was in those same situations, and I'm sure he probably made some kicks in Student Appreciation Day, and everyone's like, oh, great, whatever. It doesn't mean a dang thing, until he's out there in the horseshoe, or he's doing it certainly on the road in a big moment. Ryan Day was certainly, complimentary of him, and he made the comment too, with bringing in a new long snapper as well. That it's a whole operation. It's not just the kick itself. There's a lot of things leading up to the kick itself that has to go right, to make sure that that the kicker is set up for success. So Ryan Day was complimentary of the whole the whole operation. Noticed or mentioned that Connor had made some kicks before. At Baylor, right? Yes.
Baylor, yep.
Yeah, at Baylor, and so it's not like he's completely new to kicking in somewhat high stakes situations. But I'm not going to comment on the kicking game because
we haven't seen it yet.
Until he makes
fans.
Until he makes, I don't even say makes big kicks, until he's consistently solid from 40 to 45 yards, and I know that if a drive stalls at the 30-yard line or the 28-yard line, that Ohio State has 3 points in the bag. They have they have that in their pocket. Then until I know that, I'm not going to comment on the kicking game because I've just been burned by it too often. As all Ohio State fans can certainly relate to.
Yeah, that's been the Achilles heel of the Ryan Day teams in those big moments, in big games, is the kicking game. Like Ohio State's going to miss a key field goal. They've got to figure that out this year, and Connor Hawkins looks like he could be the guy that can do that. But again, when the lights are on you, when the pressure's on you, you're different than when you're here in the facility or when you're out on the practice field or anything else like that, and it's a completely different ball game. Guys, we appreciate you tuning in again to the Buckeye State of the Union. Dillon, go ahead and tell everybody where they can find your written work, and then also you're on social media.
Del Gazette, Gazette.com, and then at Dillon Davis 56 on Twitter. Put a lot of video and stuff on there. So, give me a follow. Certainly enjoyed getting to know Blake. He's one of the better ones that I've come across on the beats. So you're doing a great job. Appreciate you having me on, and happy to join anytime.
I appreciate you being here today.
Appreciate you, man.
Always good. Thank you.